Welcome to Season 3 of Conscious Conversations, where we aim to inspire deep and meaningful interactions that grow into a community of practice that is committed to healing, resilience, and expansion. Welcome to Conscious Conversations. Today we are having a conversation with Austen Smith, and we are talking about how we can reimagine Black lives, particularly around the context of creativity, what we do as creative beings, if we do recognize that we are creative beings, and why that energy, that life force, is sort of like laying dormant in many of us. We speak about how we can reimagine Black lives. Welcome, Austen. How are you?
I'm a lot of things. Present is one of them. Excited to have this conversation is one of them. But I'm really with all of the personal and collective grief, so that's also very present. I am everything. I am everything.
Can you please share with us and our community a little bit about who Austen is, where in your journey you are, and what inspires you?
Yes. So my name is Austen Smith. My pronouns are they, them. I am the owner and founder of Our Lunar Intelligence, which is a consulting business that's centered in Black thought, intellect, and liberatory methodology. I am also the creator of Imagination Doulas, which is a project where I explore the contents of spirit-led creative life in the imaginations of marginalized creators, educators, cultural producers, and any spirit enthusiasts. And at the root of that work, which is what inspires me, is ancestral veneration. I am what I consider to be a memory worker and a memory preserver, and I do that through writing. I do that through ritual design, social research, land and housing work, genealogy. I also do that in the form of art, so digital and sonic collages, different mediums like acrylics, woodwork, literally anywhere the spirit takes me, I will try. And so yeah, that's a little bit about me. And currently in my journey, I am learning about what is mine to do and what is not mine to do, and the difference between those things. And also learning that what I was told mine was mine is actually not. And so there's some reorientation, um, some wondering, grieving that's occurring in this journey, that has very little to do with how much I produce, but has a lot to do with who I am. So that's where I'm at.
I love that so much because a lot of the time we tend to think that we need to work very hard to achieve the things we want to achieve. But like you, I've come to understand that we are co-creators with often what is called the invisible world. And it is not up to us to sort of like ensure specific outcomes, but with how capitalism and colonization have like conditioned us, we often get so caught up in seeing the end product, right? Which a lot of the time requires manipulation of situations, of people, and so on, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I think we get caught up in being the creator and not the channel.
Mm. What led you to understand that about life or about your journey?
To be honest, failure to materialize failure to succeed, failure to do things in the ways that are legible as success, failure to fully understand why things are the way they are. Um, and I think in the um, in the depths of that failure, there were so many possibilities that I would never have known
Mhm.
had I not failed to uphold the pillars of whiteness, even lived through blackness, had I not failed um, to succeed in linear ways through academic institutions, had I not failed to be able bodied, had I not failed to do a lot of things, I would not have been forced to find another way to live.
Mm.
And in finding other ways to live, um, I come to understand life as a practice of just surrendering to all that is out of my control. And when I see what has been done with the control that has been given to us as a species, I am less and less inclined to desire control in that type of way. And so um, that has really led this practice in terms of how I let go of that desire, but also dreams. I have been a dreamer my entire life of prophetic dreams, messages delivered that I'm too young and inexperienced to understand why it's coming to me and what I should do with it. Um, but this understanding that there's life outside of life, and
Mm.
there's life beyond life, and there's life beyond death, and there's life outside of it and around it and through it. And so that understanding was is the only thing you can do is I think what bio says, like, prostrate before
Mm.
how the significance of this spirit realm that really is like a womb for what we currently call reality. Like, it's everywhere around us, in us, through us, behind us, in front of us. It will be here when we are gone. It'll be here when we return.
Mm.
And that vastness, yeah, it's just like, oh, it's like seeing I don't know, like standing before a mountain or like a giant tree, and you're just like, oh my gosh, there's so much life in here.
Mm.
And the only thing you can do is respect it, or you can destroy it, which is what other people have done across time, namely people who are trying to preserve systems uh, that thrive on death and destruction. And um, that is an option. I don't think it's sustainable, clearly. It's killing everything,
Yeah.
it's killing everyone. And it is just not proven to be a wise path forward. And so, what are the other ways?
Mm.
Is the question that I'm really curious about, and that my work is about.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you bring that up because, for years, for I think over a decade now, the term sustainability has been used so much in corporate, even by non-governmental organizations, philanthropic sort of like organizations. And yet the question is, what are we sustaining when we see year on year reports are showing the growing inequality? We are seeing the impact of the climate crisis we are living through right now. And yet people just continue talking about the same thing, sustainability this, sustainability that. But it's like, we are not seeing anything different. Instead, things are becoming worse, right? So one then really has to ask, are people actually interested in changing things? And I think from where I'm at least, I don't think people who uphold the system, people who control the economy of the world are really interested in having a different world or shaping a different world?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, the question that you ask is, what is it that we're sustaining, is a really valid question.
Mm,
Because I think the answer to that varies. And I think that the answer to that, um, in a lot of these corporations, may differ from the activists and the community organizers that are, organizing themselves around these initiatives. What
mm,
are we sustaining?
mm,
Hmm.
But anyway, we could have a conversation all day just on that. What is imagination and how different is imagination from dreaming?
Mm. Ah, I love talking about this. So for me, if imagination, well, actually, if dreaming is a practice, which it is for me, then the imagination is the site of the study. And so the imagination for me is not a factory for ideas. It's not a place where it's extractionary or it is transactional. For me, the imagination is a wrinkle in time where the ancestors in my lineage and the descendants in my lineage can come and exchange information about us and about what's going on and how to use the collective creative energy and the gifts that are unique to me, right? Because it has to move through me. Um, how to use those things to respond to my current life conditions, to larger cultural concerns, and to what the future demands of us, understanding that it's not in isolation. So when we're all doing that work in that way, when you're tending to your imagination as um, a site of time collapse where you and your people, all of them across time, can talk about what's needed and how that applies to you, there's magic that happens when everybody's doing that work, right? And so I think dreaming is the path to those realities, and the imagination is the place where that can happen. I don't think there is a geographical place where that's actually possible. I
mm,
think that the destruction that has taken place through white supremacy, through colonialism, imperialism, has made the earth, the physical earth, not, and it's not yet to the conditions. I don't want to say it's uninhabitable, but it's not yet at the conditions where dreaming can happen here without there being some surveillance about what that
mm,
dream is or some control about how that dream manifests. The imagination is that fugitive space that that actually gets we can take the time to cultivate that. We can take the time to strategize and process and put the dots together and create our plans and form these blueprints. And then what happens is that when we're in relationship with other dreamers, that plan then expands.
mm.
It starts to have other channels, it grows, it turns into a web of some sort. And I'm really curious about that web. And so to me, that's the difference, is that dreaming is the practice and the imagination is where we practice it.
You said a couple of things that struck out for me, and that is around how, in order to dream, in order to imagine, one needs to be, we need to have some sort of relationship with those that came before us, right? And all of our environment, right? Is it possible under the current conditions? Well, is it possible for most people? And I'm going to say most because I don't think many people are fully aware of who and what they are at their core, outside of the conditioning we have experienced through colonization, through not being able to practice our cultures, not being able to be authentically us. How do we then, firstly, can people achieve that? Can people create that in their own worlds, in their own lives, if they're not aware of who they actually are?
Mm. I think yes. And I think that there's always a part of us that remembers. We never completely forget.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Mainly for me, because so much of my work does not happen in the mind.
Mm-hmm.
There is a cellular knowing that I can rest in. And so I do think that people know, even if they're not cognitively aware
Okay.
of that knowing. And I do think it's possible. I think just like any energy form, it just depends on where you're spending it, and so much of our lives, especially those most impacted by um, colonization and the weaponization of expansion and of growth. Um, we hmm, if the imagine or I guess if the creative energy were like a bank account, like all of our all of our currency would be spent on surviving right now. So we
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't have much to put in the future or even the past. And so um and if it makes me think of like spoon theory in the disability justice framework, where you only have so many spoons, so you have to be very careful about what you do with them, because
Mm-hmm.
once they're gone, that you don't have any other energy to sustain any other task. If in that framework, we don't have spoons for the past or the future. We only have them for the present moment because of the conditions that are manufactured for us to be sort of time bound to right now, so
Mm-hmm.
that the past can be erased and so that the future can be manipulated toward the sustenance of colonization. And so it's almost like those are our blind spots, but they're not naturally our blind spots. Those blind spots are manufactured by the urgencies of right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that for me, it's not helpful to then say that without this energy, I don't have access to who I am. Because what that tells me is that white supremacy and colonization control my access to my ancestral practice, to the past, to the future. And I, on principle, cannot accept that.
I get
Cannot accept that in my spirit.
I get what you're saying, and I suppose for me the question was really coming from a point of um like nurturing that creative energy. And in my own research work, I've come to understand it as NTU, which is the vital force we share with all living beings, right? And so when that vital force, when that Ntu has been diminished, and it can be diminished by many things, for us, well, in my work, I look at ancestral trauma, and ancestral trauma the trauma has happened in various ways. And part of those various ways has sort of caused people to even not value who they are or where they come from, and want to look different, to look like what the European world or the Western world accepts, right? And so for me, that is the context in which I am framing that question on or around, to say, if people do not know that they have this vital force, this superpower, that when it is nurtured, when it is healthy, it helps us remember, I think, in stronger ways, and in ways that could, I think, in practical ways. Because for me, in my own journey, doing my ancestral healing work and going through a process of personal and really tapping into that, into having the ability of strengthening my ability to perceive beyond now, which is that inability you were talking about, how colonization or survival sort of like forces people to not think about the future or sense differently into the future outside of wanting to survive now. So when the Ntu is not healthy, we then show up in ways that are not helpful and regenerative, not only for ourselves, but for the ecosystem, for others, because we do not recognize that oneness, that force that we all share. Yeah.
Can I ask a clarifying question? So with
Yeah.
Ntu,
Mm-hmm.
is it possible to have a healthy relationship with Ntu and still misuse it toward your own personal gain? And the reason why I ask this is because I think about the concept of Ashe, and I
Mm-hmm.
think about how theoretically we all have it and how one uses it is still related to someone's personal agency. So we have, I mean, I think about like I think like the part where I'm like my brain is like doing like a do so I'm just kind of like not all of blackness's allegiance is toward the proliferation of healing and wellness. And I think that's something that we must, with,
Mm-hmm.
even as we're talking about these themes like liberation and justice, are that some people use their into toward wanting to be in alignment with whiteness and white values. And that's why I was wondering, is that even because this isn't my system, I don't know if that's even possible. And I don't want to, maybe it isn't possible in that framework, but I do think that there is a conversation around allegiance of like when we say, you're using it to because there is an allegiance to your own personal liberation, and that is not separate from your ancestors or the people that are coming after you. Some people see liberation as an individual, hyper individual experience
Mm-hmm.
where it's like, oh, I need to be free, even if it's at the expense of my brother or my cousin or my partner.
See, the Ntu is also comes from the word Ubuntu or Abantu. Now, when you look at Ntu in the context of the philosophy of Ubuntu, then it does not leave room for that because Ubuntu is about the all, you know. So, yeah, maybe in other worldviews, but not in the Ubuntu philosophy where people could, yeah. Because for me, Ubuntu is about all of us. It's a collective. Yeah.
Yes, and from that respect, I am you and you are me.
Exactly. So it could never be extractive, like, healing your Ntu to an extent that you believe you are superior than others, or it's not how I've come to understand it. And I'm still busy, with my research. And I always try to say to people I'm speaking to, I don't mean to romanticize African culture or being black and all of that. But Ubuntu is one of those philosophies I feel very strongly about. And I feel it has really been reduced, like what it means has been reduced over years with everybody jumping on the bandwagon of Ubuntu, using it for everything. I don't think many people truly understand what Ubuntu actually means. Because if people did, I don't think we'd be seeing the kind of things that happen, particularly in African countries that are led by Black people. And yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. I definitely think that there are risks to visibility, and those risks are real. And as you're saying that, as soon as you said Ubuntu, I was like, oh, okay, so no, there is no room for this. So thanks for connecting that. And
Yeah.
so then, from that respect, then that would be even if it's something where it looks successful in like a Western sense, that would be a weak unto, or
Yes,
like
yes,
unto that needs healing,
yes,
or okay. Thank you for that. I
absolutely.
Absolutely.
appreciate
I'll share a bit of my work around it, just so that you have a better sense of what this do actually means, and where it comes from. My next question was going to be, do you think our ability to imagine, right, is connected to the life force that we all have?
it. Um,
And I suppose,
yeah.
and I think many people can imagine, right? But are we imagining like regenerative stuff? Are we like, what are we dreaming about? What are we wanting to see? How do we see the future? Because we can imagine. The other day, I was watching TV and there was a movie came on, and in my head, like it just dawned on me that movies, even the very gruesome ones, are created by people who sit and think about these things. So I was just, it then really occurred to me, how do people sit and think about these things? How does a person even imagine some of these horrific things we see in movies?
Yes. I mean, the question is like, what are you remembering? Because a lot of this stuff is on a loop, right? We've seen a lot of this stuff over and over, especially around like storylines and plot lines and films. So the question of what are we imagining to me is connected to like, what are we remembering? And, where do we understand the imagination as memory, and where can we shift those memories where we don't have to keep seeing the same apocalyptic horrors all of the time, or having the same storylines that play out that are inherently like centering the human as the end all be all of life force. But to answer your question, so I'm currently in the Policy Link Spatial Futures Fellowship.
I saw that. Congratulations.
Thank you. Um, of their Spatial Futures Initiative, and they have a grounding framing paper. And in the framing paper, it talks about how Black, Brown, Indigenous people are often so preoccupied with financial surviving of the day, of the week, of the month, that these we are often denied the opportunity to dream and plan for our futures. And for
Mm.
me, this indicates that those of us who have been racially marginalized, which to me is different than people who are technically a part of the BIPOC community, but have benefited due to their proximity of whiteness,
Mm.
um, how we've been effectively and indefinitely locked out of linear time and space. So when I was saying like we can't get access to the past because it's being erased, and we can't have access to the future because it's not in our control, therefore we only have this little day, week, month, typically the length of a paycheck or two, to really strategize and use that energy there. That's the only place we have.
Mm.
And so across the diaspora, Black people are suffering from these conditions of homelessness or inhabitable housing situations, inadequate healthcare, underemployment, as you named. Even Black-owned businesses and Black entrepreneurs are being locked in time in a particular way, due to land and property constraints. Anti-Black violence, transphobic legislation, like literally the list goes on. These are all the conditions needed to lock us out of time and
Mm.
space. And so to be locked outside of shaping the future on a larger scale, and to be locked out of knowing who we are, where we come from, it I feel like it's like a perpetual lostness, is what it feels like. However, our ancestors are so brilliant, which I do think like our indigenous technologies really blow my mind. That like it's so profound. But they made use of the time and space outside of the time and space we were locked out of. And to me, that place is the imagination. It is where they stored all of the wisdom, all of the information needed. And I think what we struggle with is that we think we need certain information that we don't. We think we need to have names and dates and locations. We think we need to have exact information, I don't know, like vital information, birthdays. Like that stuff is useful in the context of Western record keeping, but that's not the only information and it's not the priority. Like so much of our identity is arbitrary. Our ancestors would switch names and like across the diaspora to survive would switch names, birthdays. I don't actually know what year a lot of my ancestors were born in because it says it's different on every document that I found. And so it's like they used what they needed to survive. Knowing that these categories that whiteness came up with are arbitrary and loose and approximate at best. That like this is maybe what gender is. This is maybe what and so I think that the imagination being the place where the ancestors sort of buried those hidden treasures then creates a conversation around how do we access it then in the right now, given that we are locked out according to these this context. And to me, that the right now happens in daydreaming. Daydreaming is an immediate practice. It doesn't require too much. You can do it looking with your eyes open. You can do it with your eyes closed. You can do it at work. You can do it at home. You can do daydreaming anywhere in the present moment. And that's an immediate way to access those spaces. Now, there is a conversation around how do I know when I'm daydreaming? How do I know when I'm checked out? When I'm just not present. And I think there is an intentionality to daydreaming that allows for it to happen in the right now that is around, creating the space of saying, like, I am taking this 10 minutes. I'm going to close my eyes. I'm going to ask my ancestors a question and just see what visions come.
You're bringing so many resources to this conversation, Austen. And I don't know what the context is like where you are, but in South Africa, many young Black people do not relate with their ancestors. Many young Black people do not believe in this world. And those who do, I think, just do other things that I don't necessarily want to get into right now. And so even that the energy, the resource that could be revitalizing, that could help us daydream or have access to this information, because people have not been able to identify between the real them and the conditioned them. And for me, we see it in how we consume, how people consume, what people value, what they aspire for, like, what they deem as success. And for me, some of these things, in my other life, some of these things, I feel like they also create like this wall. They disconnect us from being able to access that intelligence, right? Because firstly, in order to have spaciousness in your mind, to daydream, you need to be able to quieten your mind. I think, but you're the expert around that particular topic. But I think one needs a fair enough level of being able to quieten your mind as a practice, I think. And I don't think many people in general, at least here, practice that, so that's not...
Ways, right? Many ways to quiet your mind. Like, I can quiet my mind by just like drawing. Like, it doesn't have to look a particular way, but like when it comes to youth, when I was considered youth, I was not trying to practice the ways of my ancestors either. If I'm honest, I was so put off by it. and rejected the notions of it because it was a time for me to question everything. And I was questioning everything.
Mm.
And so there is that piece where, like, meeting the youth where they're at, it doesn't have to be about ancestry.
But I mean, even older people, like I'm 35 now, so I don't particularly fall under the youth category. But my peers, people in their mid 40s and so on, still do not recognize certain things, you know. And so for me, just looking at the demographics of the world and where we are at right now, I've given up on trying to fix the world. But you know, I still exist in this plane. And so it would be nice to live in an environment that is nurturing, you know, that is caring. So from that perspective, how do we then encourage and I don't know if we should even be encouraging people to do anything, but if we do want to live in a better world, I think tapping into that resource can be very helpful. You speak about imagination as this place where we can go and, you know, connect with this wisdom, you know, with the ways of our forefathers, where we can go to be revitalized, perhaps. So if we don't have that context, if that is not our worldview, if it's not something we believe in, what does it mean?
Mm. So if that's not the worldview or what you believe in, every single person that exists has creative life force. There's something that compels them. On an individual basis, you know, the question becomes, well, what compels you?
Mm.
What compels you? What moves your spirit when you engage in that activity? For some people, it's gardening. For some people, it's playing the guitar. For some people, it's drumming, dancing, whatever that thing is. The work of a dream practitioner like myself would be to meet somebody there. The ancestors don't need you to know the word ancestor to know them, you know, and to connect with them. It's actually in the practice of craft, of art making, that is, to me, the most sacred way to honor our ancestors. And we're honoring them whether we know it or not, when we're dancing, when we're drumming, when we're playing the guitar, when we're gardening. That
Mm.
these are areas in which you don't have to know the intellect of today's language to be with who came before you, to
Mm.
be with those. You know, you can be in the middle of strumming and be like, oh, I'm getting this like vision of, oh, it's moving me to tears. I see water, I see a boat. Like, you could see that. And you may not know, like, this is an ancestral memory, but you don't need to. All you need to do is let it move through you. And so, how do you let the spirit of creativity move through you? How
Mm.
can you commit to that as a practice? Because there will be things in life, especially in this current paradigm, that will do everything in its power to convince you out away from your creative life force. And not only to convince you away from it, but to convince you to portray it and to give it over to the system so that it can use it for whatever it wants.
I like
I
that.
think that's something that people can understand.
I like what you've just said. This thing where people are giving away their creative force unawarely, I would think. How does that work? Like, can you just share a little bit about your understanding of how that can show up in our everyday life?
So, one, like, the curriculums of public education that teach white history or teach a colonized version of a history, is one way that it convinces you away from your creative force, because then you are given a narrative to engage with creatively that's not actually a narrative that fits who you are, where you come from, or what your people experienced. And so it starts early. It starts very, very early. It starts early. Um and then from there, you move into the grading system. Is if you don't understand it this way, you can't pass to the next level of development. And so it's set up that you have to know some revised version of history that fits or meets the needs of this system, and that effectively trains you to learn it's not about who you are, it's what you can produce. If you can't produce this, then you don't progress. And in that, it's almost like a hazing process growing up, which, like, I understand the youth's rage from that perspective of like, well, now you want to tell me about my ancestors? Well, what are they doing for me right now in this situation where my teacher has kicked me out of class 3 times because I've challenged what they're. And then now I'm like at on the risk of losing like a grade, or being held back, or not graduating because I challenged the narrative, which is what I'm supposed to do in these grounds. But now I like, and so there's a setup there where from youth we're conditioned to give away our creative life force and to not use it for the things we want to use it for. And so even the attitude about art and artists and people who are dreamers, like, dreamers is basically a derogatory term at this point. If someone's a dreamer, it's like, oh, they don't take life seriously. They're always up here. They're one of those artsy, eclectic people. Like, those terms bear a certain connotation that says, I'm not responsible with my life. I don't do things according to society's standards. And because of that, I'm not valued at the same rate as someone else who, has checked all the boxes of what it means to be a contributing member of society. And so artists are people who are considered non-committal, like not really responsible to themselves or their people. There's a lot of different attitudes about art that are constructed to convince us away from moving in that path. And so then it's like, oh, if you're an artist, you're not going to make a lot of money. Artists don't really, it's really hard to break into that. How are you going to make money off of that? How are you going to make a living off of this? What do you mean ancestral veneration? How are you going to survive off, on that? And those are all ways that we can convince out of like our creative life force. So then it's like, well, I don't know what's best for me because I thought that I was meant to dance, but I guess I'm not. So tell me what I'm supposed to do. And then the system is there to be like, I'm so glad you asked. Here are 4 or 5 categories that you can choose from.
Yeah.
You can be working at a call center. You can work at this. You can do this, or you can do that.
Yeah.
If you really want to try hard, you can be a lawyer or a doctor, but this is what you got to work with.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, I don't know what to do, and I'm afraid because I trusted myself and I was wrong. So now let me hand this over to you, and I'm going to go to college, even though that may have not ever been a part of that person's plan.
What you're saying is so important, especially in today's time where mental health is such a topical issue. I was having a conversation with 2 younger people earlier today around mental health, mental illness. And, I was saying to them, I think creatives or people who are creative have been labeled a lot in around these themes, But with what I'm coming to understand is people who tend to be more creative tend to sense a lot, They are able to perceive things that neurotypical people or people who are trained to be neurotypical sort of like do not see. And because they perceive so much, because they sense so much, they're almost yeah, they're very close to being labeled as mentally unstable or unwell and, institutionalized, medicated, and so on. So, what would you say to people who are in the creative space, people who feel, that they're creative and they want to be able to express themselves in creative ways, whether it is to earn a living, or, to just be? How do you, yeah, what are your reflections on creative people and how they have been deemed, to be mentally unstable? And what I properly understand how how creative people are more open to perceiving other worlds, to seeing things differently, and so on. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, I think what you're describing is essentially like creativity or the creative spirit is is a spiritual being. And so there's no difference then between creativity and spirituality.
Mm.
I think for, like I said, I think everybody has this creative life force, but for those of us who have been able to retain some for ourselves and have not completely handed that over, um, I think you're right. I think there is a sensitivity that remains. And um, Mm, I feel like it's risky to say, and I could be incorrect, and I feel okay with that. But a mental crisis is an appropriate response to global crises.
Mm. Mm.
And so I don't think there is a more appropriate response, which means that there absolutely needs to be systems of care in the collective of people who identify as creatives specifically. And I would say there needs to be services and things like that, but then that would require, a systems participation. And I think actually we need protective barriers around us that don't involve us needing that dynamic. But there needs to be systems of care in place um, for the reality that we are sensitive, we are tethered to spirit in this way, which means that not only are we receiving downloads about what's happening now, but we're also receiving downloads from the past, and we're also receiving downloads from the future, and then all of the alternate timelines that are not this linear timeline at once. Um, we're in tune with the pain and the grief that's happening. We're in tune with the death, the feeling of just like destruction and like oppression and despair that's a global effect right now. We're in tune with that. And so, what spiritual practices of care need to be in place so that we can hold that well while also living our lives? And I think that requires us to go back to our spiritual practices, our indigenous spiritual practices, or honestly, any way that you access spirit. It doesn't have to be indigenous, it could be, you know, like maybe the book of Psalms really does a thing for you. And that's cool. Maybe that's where you feel like, oh, I feel the spirit washing over me.
Mm.
I would be curious about what spirits, but I do think that like access it how you can. But there needs to be systems of internal personal care that are supported and backed with like communal, collective practices of care um, as a protective barrier that allows for us to kind of go inward together and say like, I got you by taking care of me,
Mm.
and I want you to have me by taking care of you. And then we can be in conversation about what that means. And you can tell me what you need from me, and I can tell you what I need from you. But we need to have something, which I think are actually some things, because it's not a monolithic experience, that really allow for creatives to understand themselves as spiritual beings
Mm.
um, and as spiritually attuned beings that are like got one foot in here and a foot elsewhere.
I really
Yeah.
love that. I love that.
And so I think we spoke about this, how perhaps trauma has diminished that vital force. And you shared some tools around daydreaming, perhaps, that people could include in their daily lives to tap into that resource, right? What other ways do you think people can tap into this creative energy, that helps them to imagine in new ways?
Mhm. Um,
Because I also feel like, Austen, I also feel like because of our history with colonization and with white supremacy, there's almost like one lens through which people view success, if they're talking about success, or what a quality of life looks like. That is not necessarily us. And so this is why I want to go back, and you touched on the issue of education, to say if our history is being erased, then we have no sort of like concept of, like a material concept of what our lives could look like when we are not trying to be white, right? When we are not trying to be successful according to the prescripts of whiteness. Yeah, what other ways do you think we could tap into with the trauma that we are suffering from in mind?
hmm. Um, so one of the ways for me that I've been doing this practice is connecting to my logical heritages and through culinary stuff. And so I've been finding different cookbooks from the different countries that my ancestors are from, and then trying to make the food. And in the making the meal for myself, really grieving that I'm in my 30s and I'm just now making this for the first time,
Sure.
and that no one taught me how to make these things. And and so that has been that leads to one of the first things that I think is really important is a restoring or re-narrating how we relate to the imagination. And so understanding the imagination as our ancestral lands, because even if you are, let's say, like, you're currently in South Africa,
Hmm.
right? But the spirit of indigenous South Africa, is that when you look around, is that what you see?
No.
Right. And so even if I were to say attach some sort of romantic view onto the continent, and then I went there, I would be surprised to find that whiteness also is there too in a really particular way. And so this imagination as ancestral lands, this concept is really important for those of us who either can't trace our lineage to a particular lands at all, or it's multiple lands, or the people who are on the lands and they're seeing the literal destruction of this like ancestral inheritance of the cultivation of that land just disappearing, and like the imagination as an ancestral land is a really important reframe, so that when you are daydreaming, you start to be like, wait, that's not just a daydream. Like, what just happened?
Mm.
What was that? What did I see? Who was that to talk to me? I heard a man's voice. Where did that come from? Those are the questions that then are sort of spark from that knowing of like, wait, every time I have a vision or a daydream or a night dream, somebody's communicating. There's like communication highway. Think of it as like a crossroads where it's just like buzzing with information. Seeing it that way, I think, is really supportive to um, understanding our pre-colonial identity, even if we have to grieve that we don't have it in the material realm. And so that's one way to be with that. But it's also important to acknowledge that while we're certainly renderers, we are not the creators. We are channels. And I think that's also something to reframe, is that we are a channel for creativity to come through. That means that we're not so attached to the thing that's coming through. We just let it come and it
Mm.
goes and it's in the world. And then we're not like caught up in the ego of I am an artist, I am a filmmaker.
Yeah.
It's like, even I am a researcher. Like I try not to lead with that. I like to lead with other stuff before I'm like, I do research. And, but really, this is about ancestral veneration,
Mm.
but to not have that attachment to what comes through.
Mm.
I think, secondly, is understanding that ideas are agential beings. That's
Please say
something
that
that I
again.
explore in the imagination tools.
Ideas are.
Hmm?
Say that again.
Yes, ideas are agential. So ideas have their own agency. They're their own beings with their own life force. That paired with the idea that we're just the channel
Mhm.
allows for an idea to be what it needs to be without our projections or expectations about what that needs to look like.
Mhm.
And so any creative process, even if it's just you, is a collaboration. If you've got an idea, you are now in collaboration with another being, particularly with the more than human.
I love that. And so, Austin,
And
what
then
do
the
you,
last thing,
yeah,
oh,
please go.
oh, I was gonna say the last thing is that challenging this idea of what we call a creative block.
Yes.
Um, I think that's really important too. I think it should be broken down into two primary categories. There's a creative block that's caused by systemic barriers, and then there's mandatory pauses in a creative process that are just naturally occurring. And
Okay.
I think if anybody were to write down a list of like, what are the sources of your creative block, you might find that many or all of them are actually systemic barriers.
Mm.
And to me, that's really important because it redistributes accountability and blame. And creatives, I think, are conditioned to take on all of the responsibility for not having something manifest the way it needs to manifest. And
Mhm.
so when we have a block, it's our fault. It's all of the common, like, the characteristics of creative blocks that you can look up online, like emotional dysregulation or interpersonal conflict or imposter syndrome or financial issues. These are all things that I question, what's underneath that? Is it microaggressions that are underneath that imposter syndrome that you're experiencing microaggressions in the workplace? Is it like employment structures that are underneath the experience of financial issues? When you go deeper, you find oftentimes that your creative block is actually a systemic barrier and it's real time oppression, not something that's theoretical, but something that's happening right now. Allowing that to redistribute that blame to where it needs to go allows for you to kind of take that pressure off yourself to say, of course I can't do this, not in these conditions.
Mm.
And so then you can go back to your imagination and say, look, ancestors, I can't do this in these conditions. I'm going to need some other alternatives to support me if this is my work. That type of
Love
negotiation
that.
process is agency, it's total agency. And it gives us the power back versus this narrative that we can't have it without, you know, I don't know, partnering with the institutions.
Mhm.
Absolutely not. And so I think that those are my three things that I would say is like start to re-narrate. The imagination is where you communicate with your ancestors. The ideas that come to you are their own beings with their own agency. And then recognizing the creative block as um, like two things. The first one is that it's a mandatory pause where the idea is like, I want you to reflect. Is this what we need to be doing? But then there's the likelihood that it's a systemic barrier and that this is just the impact of living in a world that is fueled by oppression and that you are actively experiencing that. And so to be with those reframes of these ideas, I think allows for some spaces of possibility of, oh, okay, well, if my ancestors are in here and they're telling me to do this, but I got these problems, what do I need for this to come through me? And it's like, oh, okay, let me write my needs down and put them on my altar. That's a completely different arrangement in a relationship to your own personal power, right?
Love that.
Yeah.
I love that. And I mean, of course, that practice can apply to people who don't necessarily right? So people who do not work in the creative space can also use those 3 tools to resource themselves and to have a different relationship with their environment and with their own output, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. I think it's for anyone who is interested in being a channel,
I
you
love
know,
it. I love
that can
it.
happen anywhere.
Mm.
What is your dream for Black people or for people of color?
My dream for Black people, I would say, um, so Toni K. Bambara says in an interview, she says there is an aspect of Black spirit, of inherent Black nature that we have not addressed. The tension, the power that is still latent, still colonized, still frozen and untapped. We do not know how to unleash. We do not even know how to speak of it in a courageous manner yet. I always feel like that quote is a call to action. And so I dream of Black people remembering. I dream of Black people tapping into that latent power, that frozen power. I dream of Black people returning to daydreaming as a research methodology, as a scientific method. I dream of Black people making meaning of the world beyond whiteness's limited understandings of success, of gender, of healing, of sex, of education, housing, of accountability, of law and governance, of work and rest, all of the things that make worlds worlds. I dream of the Black spirit in Black people thawing out and remembering and flooding with energy to destroy what is not in service of this. And I dream of a future, all of the differences in the variances of Blackness as gifts, instead of points of conflict between us. And so I would say those are my dreams.
It is such a beautiful dream. It's making me emotional. It's so beautiful. Can you just imagine that? Oh my goodness. I think life would be so full. Yeah. No, I can definitely imagine that. And I do hope that we get to experience a little bit of it in this lifetime's going.
You know that meme where the guy's like sprinkling the little that's how I feel like, just give me a little bit of that.
Just a little bit of it.
Oh man. Austen, it's been great having this conversation with you. Thank you so much for making the time to have this conversation with us. Is there anything you want to add, perhaps?
I'm thankful for you and I'm thankful for your ancestors. Thank you for reaching out to me. And, you know, the We Will Dance with Mountains is such a vast community. And I'm just so grateful that somehow we were in those streets together and that led you to me. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing the work that you do. It sounds amazing, and I'm really, really grateful to see the way that Black spirit is moving. Like, it's just a beautiful thing. And so just thank you for having me here. I really appreciate it.
I need that quote, or I need the author, so I can go read up on their work. So when you get a chance, please pop it up. Send me a link or something. Yeah, thank you for this awesome conversation.